How's it going, everybody? We are back for another quick little video today. Back in my kitchen, and today we are going to talk about tips and tricks for dehydrating your own camping and backpacking food. Andy and I started dehydrating our own food years ago. And it just kind of naturally stemmed from the fact that we like to cook and we like to save money when we can backpacking. So we looked into dehydrating our own food, and a couple years later, I would say we probably dehydrate about 60 to 80% of the meals we eat on the trail. Why do we dehydrate? The obvious answer is it's a lot cheaper. You can make a nice dehydrated backpacking meal, like a nice one for, $2, $3 versus a Mountain House or something like that. It's gonna be like $8, $9. Now we don't dehydrate 100% of our food, but that's kind of a good balance for us. Another reason we dehydrate our own food is it just gives you a much greater control over the nutrients and the quality of the food you make. You can pick what things you like, you can substitute certain meats. If you want to change up the nutritional makeup of what you're making, you have a much greater control over it versus, if you just buy a Mountain House, you have to eat the Mountain House that you buy. You have no control over the customization of it. Everything I'm going to tell you about in this video, we have just learned the hard way. We've screwed up a lot of dehydrating meals, and we've learned a lot. And we just want to impart that to you all so that hopefully you start dehydrating your own meals. The first tip is you want to eliminate as much fat as you can in your dehydrating meals. So the way we do that is we generally use ground turkey versus ground beef. And then we rinse the meat after we've cooked it in really hot water to get as much fat out of it as possible. And that's because the more fat you have, the greater amount of rancidification you'll have in it. That means your meal going rancid and spoiling. Use as little fat as you can. A way to get around that is, we'll take little droppers of olive oil with us out in the trail. We've taken butter with us out in the trail. So if you want to get more fat into your food, just add it. Aside from the dehydrated meal itself. If you're dehydrating any vegetables to put in your meal, which you probably will, most meals have some sort of vegetables in them, you need to blanch or cook the vegetables before you dehydrate them. I've made that mistake before of just cutting up some onions. I was like, oh, it'd be nice to have some fresh onions or something in my meal. It doesn't work that way. You need to blanch or steam or cook your vegetables in some form so that they dehydrate well, and then more importantly, they rehydrate well and they're not all weird. I generally prefer steaming just because we get lazy and we will buy frozen vegetables in a steamer bag and just steam them and then dehydrate them. But you can also blanch them, which is essentially cooking them really quickly before you throw them in the dehydrator. We generally don't dehydrate fruit, surprisingly, because we like dry bananas and stuff like that. We've done it before, but we generally don't dehydrate fruit. If you are dehydrating things like bananas or apples, you can spritz them with lemon juice so they won't brown while they're dehydrating. That's a nice little tip. But like I said, we generally don't dehydrate fruit. No reason other than we don't want to dehydrate everything, so we usually buy trail mix that has dehydrated fruit in it. But if you are dehydrating fruit, consider that. Another tip is remember, every time you dehydrate, your house will reek of the smell of whatever you're dehydrating now. I personally think it's awesome because when I make buffalo chicken, my whole house smells like a Buffalo Wild Wing in a good way. But just know that if you're dehydrating something with a lot of spice in it, I know people that have made their own chili powder, and don't do that inside. You literally have tear gas in your house. So just know whatever you're dehydrating, your house is gonna smell. By far the most important factor when you're dehydrating your food so it dehydrates properly so that it will rehydrate properly is surface area. So you want as much surface area as possible, both the food itself, so that means if you're doing something like ground beef, make sure the ground beef or the ground turkey breaks up into the smallest crumbles you can. If you're doing vegetables, cut them up finely. And then when you put them in the dehydrator, make sure they're spaced properly. The more surface area you have, the greater your food's gonna dehydrate, and therefore the greater it will rehydrate. If you don't, do your meat well and it's these huge chunks, they get kind of chewy when you rehydrate them. And that's because there's some moisture still left in the meat when you dehydrate it. So surface area is key. So whatever you're dehydrating, cut it up into as finely little bits as possible or thin as possible. So like if you're making banana chips, make them thin. And then when you put them on the dehydrator, make sure they're spaced properly so that you get adequate airflow around them to dehydrate. I'll briefly talk about dehydrating temperatures because it does vary based on what you're dehydrating. Generally, meats, stuff like that, get dehydrated at higher temperatures than fruits and vegetables. Go with what your dehydrator says to do. You know, our dehydrator on the front of it has a setting and a temperature for each kind of thing you're dehydrating, and that might change based on your dehydrator. But just know in general, meats and stuff like that get dehydrated at higher temperatures than fruits and vegetables. Do not make the mistake of, let's say you're trying to dehydrate vegetables, but you want to do it in a quicker time, so you increase the heat. Do not do that. Stick to the correct heat for that food and give it the right amount of time. When we're talking about the time it takes to dehydrate stuff, my biggest tip for you is do your dehydrating in the evening and just let it go overnight. Generally, I dehydrate meat-based stuff for 12 to 14 hours, and fruits and vegetables, stuff like that, are a lot less. But just set it, go to bed, and then when you wake up, you come down and get your coffee and your house smells like buffalo chicken. Another tip and something we practice is we try and stay away from dehydrating dairy products. We leave that to the professionals. So your cheeses, your milk products, stuff like that, maybe even eggs. Just don't do it. I mean, you can try it if you want. The problem with those products is they naturally contain bacteria in them, and they can dehydrate a little weird and rehydrate a little weird. And if you want something like cheese in your meal, you're probably gonna be backpacking and might be bringing cheese anyway, so just cut it up and throw it in. Or you can buy powdered cheese, you can buy powdered milk, you can buy powdered eggs, and they're relatively inexpensive. So if you want a meal that has something like cheese or milk-based cream sauce in it, just consider buying it and then adding it to the food you dehydrate later. So if you wanna make, chicken Alfredo with like maybe an Alfredo meat sauce, you could dehydrate the pasta and the meat separately, and then for $1, buy an Alfredo packet. So leave dairy to the professionals. So tips for storing foods and how well you dehydrate will affect the storage and how long your foods store for. Generally speaking, if you are going to dehydrate your food and put it in a freezer, you're gonna get at least a year out of it. Now, I can't speak from experience because I've never dehydrated something that has sat that long in our freezer. We do a pretty good job of eating them. Now you can also keep your foods at room temp, but you're gonna be back down to about 6 months. Another tip is if you're not going to vacuum seal your food and you put it in the freezer, every time you go buy beef jerky or something like that, save those desiccant packets and just throw that with your food in the freezer. Now, another tip is if you don't want to deal with that, vacuum seal your food. By vacuum sealing, you get rid of a lot of the moisture and a lot of the air, so your food stores a lot longer. I'm gonna be honest with you, the only reason I don't vacuum seal is because my vacuum sealer broke, and I'm generally not concerned with storing foods for more than a year, and I store everything in the freezer. But if you are gonna store stuff in the freezer and it's not vacuum sealed, consider throwing a desiccant packet in there. But in general, you're gonna be good to go for at least a year, anything you dehydrate properly. And to be honest with you, we've never had food sit longer because we do a good job of eating it. Now, let's talk a little bit about rehydrating your food. So the textbook way to figure out the perfect amount of water to rehydrate your food with is to literally weigh your food after you cook it, dehydrate it, and weigh it after you dehydrate it and subtract the difference, and that's exactly how much water you need to put in. I've done that once. Ain't nobody got time for that. The good guideline and rule of thumb that we've always found work is just put enough water in to cover your food and then maybe a little bit more. And then if you want a little bit soupier, add more water. If you don't, add less water, but just cover your food with water and then maybe just a tiny bit more. And you're probably gonna be good to go. And then you can always watch it while you're rehydrating. If you need to add more or less water, you can do that. Another tip is you generally wanna be as sterile as possible when you're cooking your food and when you're dehydrating it. So sometimes I'll wear gloves to keep my oils from my skin and the bacteria from my skin on the food. You know, after you dehydrate the food, there's probably still gonna be a little bit of moisture in there, and then you might have a bacteria issue, but try and be as sterile as possible. You know, cook your food and then dehydrate it. Don't let it sit around. Then more bacteria will get on it. Try and have a kind of a clean environment in your freezer. Obviously, make sure the food you dehydrate is in individual bags and try and get as much air out of there, but you wanna be as sterile as possible. Generally, when you dehydrate food, you lose a lot of the flavor and you can smell it. That's why our house smells so good. You're just gonna lose some of that flavor. It's gonna come off of the food as that hot air is dehydrating it. So we always bring hot sauce, maybe some salt and some pepper with us. So just know that you're gonna lose a little bit of flavor when you dehydrate stuff, so consider bringing some sort of spice or additive just to give it that little extra kick. Another tip, and this is because I've screwed this up, is after you dehydrate your food, it's obviously gonna be very hot. Wait for it to cool to room temperature before you store it, even if it's a room temp or if it's in the freezer. If the food is really warm and you put it in a freezer bag and you put it in your freezer, it's gonna cause the moisture in that air to condense in there and your food's gonna have more moisture. Same if you just put it in a bag and room temp. If your food's really warm, you're gonna get more moisture collect on that bag. So let your food cool to room temperature before you store it. Some of our favorite foods to dehydrate. We really like dehydrating buffalo chicken. We just did a video on that. We really like pasta-based stuff, so Andy makes a mean chili mac. Spaghetti meat sauce is like super easy, and then I like to take it a little step further and make barbecue pasta, so kind of spaghetti, meats, onions, barbecue sauce. Also, our favorite lunch item to dehydrate is easily our trail burritos. You can see videos for all these foods. We also we do dehydrate our own beef jerky, so we do a lot of stuff, and it's fun for us. We like to cook, we save a lot of money, and especially because usually Andy and I are going with other people, like our wives. When you dehydrate, you just make a lot of food, so it's good, it feeds a lot of people. So thank you all for watching. Take a stab at dehydrating, you won't regret it, and let us know in the comments your favorite stuff to dehydrate. I hope more people get into this, and it just gives you greater control over the cost and the nutrition of your food. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you all in the next one.